What is up, World Civ students? Today we're starting the part 2 of Napoleon Bonaparte notes. And this might take 2, might take 3 lectures, we'll see. But we'll get through it, so you should be following along in your Napoleon notes notes guide that I passed out to you guys before you left on that last Thursday we were there. We did part 1 yesterday. We're going to do, start part 2 today. And we'll just get rolling. My goal is to finish the Napoleon notes on Monday at the absolute latest. Just remember where we left off, the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon had just sold it to the Americans, so the British couldn't have it, and so he could make money and fund his army. So this gives him everything he needs to start waging war against the other Europeans. After selling the Louisiana territory, Napoleon will focus his efforts on conquering Europe, and he's actually very successful all around, but also in annexing for France, northern Italy, and the Austrian Netherlands. He also set up his own puppet government in Switzerland, and I'm skipping a lot of things here. Let me see. I'm going to do this probably a lot here because I don't know why, but they want us to focus more on his decline instead of his incline. And part of what we're going to be doing next week is watching a Napoleon Bonaparte documentary, maybe. And that documentary does a good job of showing his rise, not only to power in France, but his conquering of Europe. So something you need to understand is Napoleon, we're fast forwarding a few years, or really only briefly mentioning the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, where he crushes the Austrian army. But he conquers Europe, which is, well, it's pretty impressive. No one's done that since Rome, really. And even Rome wasn't able to get what is modern-day Germany. So the fact that he's able to do this so quickly shows his prowess. I don't know if you can see Mira here, but she's here. We'll see what she does. Oh, don't step there. That's not good. That's not good at all. All right, so in the red is the British and their allies, those that are still allied against Napoleon. They're not with Napoleon. Now keep in mind that Napoleon started this whole war in 1805. Maybe even you could argue in like 1804. But, excuse me, what's wrong with me? It wasn't like this during my psych notes. So the red are his enemies, those that remain. The dark blue or the royal blue, is Napoleon's direct empire. This is the territory that he directly controls. He is the direct ruler of those territories. The sky blue is the dependent states, meaning that they answer to him directly, but he might have one of his siblings in charge of that land as king or whatever the case is. And in purple are the allies of Napoleon. Pretty much everybody that's not in red or white, and Russia will even be added to this eventually, is under Napoleon's control. He got them either to surrender or to negotiate a peace treaty. Pretty much he's in control of all of Europe. The only areas he's not in charge of is Sicily, Sardinia, Portugal, and the United Kingdom, which includes Ireland, by 1812. That's an important thing. So Napoleon goes on to capture the German kingdoms that used to be, before him, a part of the Holy Roman Empire, and he's actually going to be the final, nail in the coffin to the Holy Roman Empire, so that's not going to exist really anymore. He's going to change it to the Confederation of the Rhineland, right? Which, the Rhine River is a big deal in Germany, so that's probably why he named that, was because of the river. And because it's called the Rhineland, but it's probably called the Rhineland because of the river. He kept power by placing his supporters, usually siblings, in high power throughout these nations in Europe. And he starts this thing called nationalism. The people of France love him because of his military success and his stability. He does the things that he promises. He gives them their rights, or when he does take away their rights, he does it in a way where they don't really notice, or they are willingly and happy. He's convinced them to happily give them away. And so he really starts this thing called nationalism. And that word, nationalism, is probably the most important vocab word of the entire semester. And I'm not exaggerating that. It is the most important word for the whole semester, because before the 30 Years' War, before the 30 Years' War, everything was about religious differences. All wars were about religious differences. Post 30 Years' War, you start to see things begin to change, and with Napoleon, it really forms into this. From Napoleon forward, it's about nationalism. And what nationalism is it is, hello, Mira. It is a crazy amount of loyalty and love for your country. Get comfortable, Mira. Crazy amount of loyalty for your country, to the extent, it will get to the extent, okay, you're just going to leave? No, you're going to stay? This is going to get to the point where you might even get into a fist fight with somebody just because they insulted your country. It's kind of like how people are with sports teams. You insult LeBron James, or you say that Michael Jordan is better than LeBron James, and some people are like about to fight you over that, even though it's true. Just saying. That's kind of what nationalism is. So nationalism is pride and loyalty in one's country. Like your loyalty for your country, your love for your country is so intense that some nations in this time period will actually go to war with each other purely because somebody insulted them. Talk about being a snowflake. Here we have a very famous portrait of Napoleon. Napoleon! By the French accent. He really wasn't an attractive man, and women did not find him attractive. He's very unhygienic in a lot of, especially when he was younger. But this painting is obviously a dramatization. He's got shapely legs. He's got epic hair and an epic hat, and he's like, And that's a form of nationalism. It's propaganda. People would see this painting, would see a poster of this and think, wow, that's my leader, and you'd have a surge of pride in your nation. So that's a big purpose behind this. Of course, he didn't really look like that ever in an actual battle. You wouldn't want a giant cape like that. So due to Napoleon's success on the battlefield, Russia, Austria, and Prussia signed peace treaties with France to end the conflict. France's only real enemy left is England and those that side with them. Portugal's not really a threat, so Napoleon thinks. I don't know what's up with me. So Napoleon officially gets Russia. That's the big one here, because we already know about Austria and Prussia. Gets Russia to sign a peace treaty. So during this time of eliminating his opponents, Napoleon will lose only one battle, and that's the Battle of Trafalgar, and that is a huge deal because it's kind of the battle for England, right? So England at this time, since Spain and the Habsburgs have kind of declined after the 30 Years' War, England is the world's strongest navy by far. England is far superior on the oceans than any other nation. And they're very proud of that. So if you haven't noticed, England is an island. The UK is 2 islands, if you include Ireland, which is not a part of the UK today, but it was back then. You kind of have to take boats to get there. And so it's kind of like when we were talking about the Spartans and the Athenians, one was good on the ocean, one was good on the land. Well, one's going to have to eventually meet the other on their home turf. And so that's what's going to happen. Napoleon's going to meet the English on their home turf, and I'm just accepting it. And he knows that the French cannot beat the English Navy on their home turf alone. If Napoleon has the best land army, but again, you can't get to England without crossing the English Channel. So he's going to team up with Spain, who again, his brother has been put in charge of Spain. And you know what? Spain doesn't like England anyway because Spain used to be the strongest navy, so they have a bit of a rivalry there. So France and Spain team up together to go up against England to try to get Napoleon to land on English soil. And Napoleon's going to lose this battle, even though the English are heavily outnumbered. It's like I tell you guys over and over again. Numbers, although important, are not as important as tactics and technology. And England is the proven naval power. They have the experience. They have the tactics. They have the technology. Napoleon has the numbers, and it's just not enough to win. So the loss for Napoleon at Trafalgar causes 2 major realizations, 2 major issues. Well, number one, it guarantees that England is going to have superiority over the oceans and the water. Napoleon can have his land, but he's not getting to England. He's not trading or using ships to really move around much because England has superiority there, which is going to limit Napoleon's mobility and ability to, later on he tries to put a blockade around England, but how are you going to do that if they have a better navy? Second, it forces Napoleon to realize that he can't get to England. And much later on, Hitler's going to kind of have the same realization, except they have airplanes by then. Because he can't get to England. He's just going to have to give up, right? Because of that separation of the water. The English Channel has saved England from being conquered many a times. So this is Admiral Nelson. He was in charge of the British. And kind of an interesting story is he was the one commanding, but he knew that this was like, if we lose this battle, we lose England. If Napoleon is able to land on English soil, their land army is so superior to ours, it's all decided here on the ocean. If we lose here, we lose England. So he knew what was on the line. He was in charge. He actually gets shot through the chest and into the spine. And he refuses to die until he knows the battle is won. They bring him down below deck, and he commands the battle while on his deathbed. And after the battle is won, after he knows the battle is won, he dies. But he was a victor. He won the battle, and England was saved from Napoleon. A monument dedicated to that, right? Because now they're not speaking French. So now that's my summary of Napoleon's constantly winning. Like all he can do is win. Now we're going to start talking about his decline, right? Which is gradual, but just keep in mind that you could spend a whole semester on just Napoleon's victories and his rise to power. But as Machiavelli says, gaining the power is the easy part. Keeping the power is the hard part. And Napoleon is about to learn that. He just wants to keep on conquering as soon as he has Europe. The challenge now is to keep Europe, and that's where the problems start to arise. Great quote from Napoleon. He says, never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake. Just let him make the mistake. Brilliant advice. Brilliant. By 1806, the only areas of Europe free from Napoleon's control were Britain, Portugal, Sweden, and the Ottoman Empire, which was southeast Europe. You probably noticed that that was white on the map. Now, the Ottoman Empire is starting to decline, though. That's starting to really begin. However, I don't think Napoleon was that interested in the Ottoman Empire's territories. I think that's the main reason why he didn't really pursue that. He was much more interested in Portugal and England. Now, in your packets, these two bottom bullet points are not there, but they are test questions. And so I want you to write these two bullet points wherever you have space. It's the only time you have to do that. Everything else is like this top bullet point where you're just filling in the blank. But these two bullet points down here, you need to write because they're very important. Something that the notes, because I added this, the notes don't really do is talk about Napoleon's personal life at all. And that's something that I feel the documentary that sometimes I show, although not the most interesting documentary, it does do an amazing job of showing Napoleon's personal life. So his first wife is Josephine Desharnais, and I know it's spelled really weird, but again, it's French. And she's a girl that he's loved for a very long time. He, tried, when he was young, before he had a big name for himself, he kept trying to woo her, and she kind of thought he was annoying and gross. But as she got older, started to lose some of her attraction because she was kind of a prostitute, kind of. She realized that she needed to settle down with somebody, and she knew Napoleon would take care of her. So she ends up falling in love with him. I think when they first got married, she probably was just doing it for kind of like gold digger reasons. But they do grow to love each other slowly. He always loved her, but she kind of slowly begins to love him. While he's out on his victory campaigns, she, right after they were married, she actually cheats on him. And when he comes back, he's absolutely distraught, and she is upset that she got caught. There's a story of her begging outside of his bedchamber, asking for forgiveness. And because, again, he is her supply of money and power. And he does forgive her. He does not divorce her after, she cheated on him. But Napoleon was pretty loyal to her before this. But now he's going to fully embrace kind of the standard that was for French monarchs, that it was weird if a French monarch didn't have multiple mistresses. And so after she cheats on him, after that betrayal happens, he kind of, I guess, sees it as permission or maybe revenge or something, that he's going to just start sleeping with, lots of women. And, he'll tell her things like, well, I love you. They're just fleshly pleasures, right? But I do genuinely believe that his love for her is genuine. Unfortunately for him, he's going to have to divorce her because she cannot bear him children. April 1st, 1810, Napoleon will marry Mary Louise of Austria. Don't get her confused with Marie Antoinette from the French Revolution. Although they're both from the same country and they're both princesses from that same country and they share the first name, they're different people. So the only reason Napoleon divorced Josephine was because she couldn't bear him children. And, he still really loved her. So he actually pays for her to live a nice life. He gets her a villa. A yearly income that's very generous. He still loved Josephine. He wanted to take care of her, but he also very much so falls in love with his new wife, even though it was originally out of duty. So from 1807 to 1812, Napoleon is struggling to maintain his empire, and that's also when this stuff happens. So while he is dealing with this massive empire that he's trying to control and keep everybody in line, he's also dealing with some marital troubles, right? I'm sure this was quite stressful for him and, of course, the women as well. But yeah, important stuff, important stuff. I find some of his personal life details to be kind of interesting. So as of 1812, this is what the map looks like. You know, everything in orange are his enemies, although Russia's new. For a long time, Russia is actually his ally. But we're going to talk about why Russia suddenly isn't, and that's kind of the beginning of his downfall here. And you can see some of these battle marks down here in Spain. That's also going to be part of his downfall as well. There's going to be three main reasons. Had an itch on my leg there. There's ants in here. I'm getting bit. It's true. So yeah, green, light green, purple. They're either directly controlled by a sibling, like his brother is the king of Spain, his brother Joseph, or a satellite country. And you can see the Ottoman Empire down there in whitish tan as well. I don't think he was really all that interested in Southeast Europe, the Slavic peoples. So Napoleon had three major disastrous mistakes, and that's predominantly what we're going to be focusing on for the remainder of today. We're going to go through the first two and begin talking about the third one. Probably get pretty decent into the third one. So number one, the continental system. Napoleon realized he couldn't defeat England through military means, so now he's going to try to defeat them economically. So he developed this plan called the continental system. And you probably want to star this in your notes because a lot of people get this wrong on the test because it's named the continental system, but it's a blockade, right? So continental system's not really, it doesn't really sound like a name you would give to a blockade, but that is the name. It's the name for the policy. So you might want to make note that it's really hard to remember. The plan is to make a blockade of British goods, right? So he's going to put ships basically surrounding Europe to prevent people from trading with England. So he wants to destroy England's economy. But you're probably noticing the failure in logic there. England has the best navy. That's already been proven. So if you couldn't beat the British Navy condensed in one place, what makes you think you're going to be able to defeat the English Navy if your navy is spread out for hundreds and hundreds of miles? Just saying. You can see it right here. If your military couldn't handle the English here, what makes you think that your navy spread out all along this dotted line is going to be able to defend that line? No. England is going to attack the one ship every 100 miles that is positioned there, and it's a fail. And that's the problem, you know. If you're going to be in charge, if you're going to be a leader, you can't set rules that are going to make you weak, right? So you can't set rules that you're not going to enforce. So, for example, if we came back April 20th and I came really hard down on hoods, you know, you can't wear hoods or hats. And then you came in on that first day and you had your hood on and I didn't say anything about it. I said I was going to do something and then I didn't. You're going to wear your hat. You're going to wear your hood because you know that there's no consequences. You have to back up a threat if you're going to make it, especially if you're in charge. So him making this threat, this blockade, and saying, if you trade with England, if you break my blockade, if you break the continental system, I will hunt you down and gut you like a fish. He can't back that threat up. Or if he does, what's going to happen, you know, countries don't abide by the continental system, then he's in a war with them, which you got to think about these things. I would have probably just let England be England, but Napoleon is very determined on achieving as much glory for his name as possible. Personally, I would have tried to not tick off England, but it is what it is. Because here's the thing. Who trades with England? Well, these other countries. So does it only just affect England, or does it affect England and the countries that normally trade with them? And of course, this is where some of you would shout out and give the wrong answer. The correct answer is yes, of course it affects their economy. If you can't trade with your main source of, let's say, grain any longer, that's going to affect your economy. And so not only does it hurt Napoleon's enemies, but it hurts his allies, which ticks them off. So not a good move on his part. So once again, it fails first. So many European nations were dependent on goods they acquired from England. They were suffering from the trade blockade. And was it number 2? Second, France's navy was too weak to enforce the blockade, as I've already said. Napoleon tried to threaten nations, for ignoring the blockade. Like, I'm going to attack you. I'm going to get you. And there, just kind of ticks them off and kind of reignites some hatred for Napoleon. And so he's actually going to lose some allies out of this. And he's going to have to follow up on his threats, which lead to some of his other mistakes. So the British react with their own blockade, with their superior navy, which can actually enforce the blockade. And the British stop almost all traffic coming in or near the coast of Europe. But the English make one crucial mistake. They start stopping neutral ships, and that includes U.S. ships, which is going to tick off Americans because England still really hates America at this point. This is a real problem. They're going to start stopping American ships because they don't like America. They maybe steal some of our goods, treat our seamen improperly, cruelly, and that ticks off America. They see this as a declaration of war. And so the U.S. is going to declare war on Britain in 1812. And this is known as the War of 1812, which is kind of, you could say, the American Revolution Part II, England's revenge, or at least attempted revenge. So England would, in their blockade to counteract the continental system, would stop U.S. ships and other ships, but U.S. ships in particular, and they would loot those ships and sometimes hurt or maybe even kill I'm not sure if they killed them. Don't quote me on that. Some of the the English sailors. Second big mistake is the Peninsula War. So you probably noticed that Portugal was, there and not a part of Napoleon's system, and he wants to fix that. So in an effort to get Portugal to accept the continental system, you probably noticed on the map of the continental system, it did not go around Portugal. It stopped with Portugal, right? So Portugal could still trade with England. So in order to do that, he's going to try to finally conquer Portugal. But in order to do that, you have to get through Spain. The Spanish don't really like him because he's put his brother Joseph on the throne. I mean, imagine if let's imagine that China conquered the world and the communist dictator president of China put his brother as the king of America. You probably wouldn't like him too much, right? Why would you want a French person being the king of Spain? You want him to speak Spanish, dadgummit. So here's France up here, here's Spain, here's Portugal, right? So this is our setting. There's Joseph, Napoleon's brother. And this is a huge mess for Napoleon. Second big mistake. 2 strikes, 3 and you're out. And that's exactly how many he gets. So Spanish guerrilla fighters struck out against France on their way down to Spain. Or sorry, on their way down to Portugal, which Napoleon did not expect. He did not expect to have to fight Spanish rebels in addition to Portugal. By the way, when I say guerrilla fighters, I don't mean a bunch of Harambe's hiding in the forest, okay? What a guerrilla fighter is, basically the Spanish will sneak up on Napoleon's forces, shoot a few bullets, then run away before Napoleon's army can really do anything in retaliation. And they just repeat this process over and 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 over again, right? Just endlessly, tons and tons of time. So this war is called the Peninsular War because it was fought entirely on the Iberian Peninsula, which is what we call the peninsula which Spain resides on. Napoleon's going to lose about 300,000 troops to these guerrilla fighters. That's a lot for this time period. For World War I, that's chump change. But for Napoleon, that's a lot of people. And this is really showing the rest of the world that Napoleon isn't perfect, that he can bleed. So if you know, like sharks, they can smell blood from I think like a mile or more away. So the other countries are like, I smell blood, Napoleon blood, and they're going to seek it. All the sharks, England, now Russia, later Austria, all these, well, not Austria, but, well, eventually Austria. All these other countries smell the blood in the water. They're heading towards Napoleon, ready to pounce. They smell the blood. Oh, by the way, what he's wearing here, you've probably noticed several pictures from like the Civil War era where they have like the hand in between the buttons. Napoleon's the one that made that fashionable. He's also the reason why these hats are popular. That to say, he wasn't a very fashionable person, but within the military, he was just such a lovable person that, people wanted to dress like him, so they copied him. So he was a fashion trendsetter in the military, but that's not anywhere else, though. Military has different fashion standards. So the third big mistake and his final big mistake and his biggest mistake is the invasion of Russia. So Russia does not listen to the continental system, and they smell the blood in the water. And you know what? Napoleon made that threat, and now he's got to follow through on it. So he marches into Russia with about 500,000 troops. He decides to invade Russia after the Tsar Alexander I refused to stop selling grain to Britain. And the crazy thing is Napoleon had a meeting with Alexander I, and he actually thought they were like close friends. Like Napoleon genuinely liked Alexander, and he thought that they were like buddies. But Alexander, turns out, was just kind of pretending. Alexander also had competing designs with France on how to use the land of Poland, which would also cause some tension. Here's a portrait of Tsar Alexander I, Romanov, of course. And my goodness, that guy is not attractive. He got a long neck, some weird funky hair. You just need to shave that stuff. And the weirdest little baby face ever. Gonna give me nightmares. Oops. So at nearly 500,000 strong, the Grand Armée marches through Western Russia, winning a number of minor engagements until they reach the Battle of Smolensk on August 16th to the 18th. And this is where we're going to start seeing a pattern with Russia, right? At the same time as this, the right wing of the Russian army stops part of the French army at the Battle of Polotsk. This prevents the French from marching on the Russian capital of St. Petersburg. Unfortunately for Napoleon, here's a few pictures of St. Petersburg and the Winter Palace there in Russia. And that's Versailles, I believe. No, that's not Versailles. That's the Russian Palace. My bad. Can you hear Henry? All right, so the fate of the war had been decided on the Moscow front, where Napoleon himself had yet to be, well, let me read this exactly. The fate of the war had to be decided on Moscow front because St. Petersburg's front didn't work out. Okay, so I said it right. So now we'll focus purely on Napoleon. So after the Battle of Smolensk, Napoleon, he's advancing, and the real problem here is that the Russians start practicing something we call scorched earth policy. And basically what that is where you burn crops and kill livestock so that your enemy can't get it. Usually this is done by the offensive side. So like in the American Civil War, the North did this to the South after they took what they wanted, of course. But what makes this so unique is that the Russians are doing it to themselves. So the Russians will lose a battle, retreat, burn everything that the French could use to eat, and then retreat again. And they just keep repeating this further and further, deeper into Russia. And Napoleon keeps following them further and further and deeper into Russia. So the problem is they're burning all of Napoleon's potential food. Like, well, why didn't he just get stuff up from France? Well, he has his supply line, but that's a long distance. Food getting to the soldiers all the way from France or even Austria would be an excruciatingly long process, not to mention just food, but bullets as well. So Napoleon's supply lines are reaching thin, and he can't use the land around him, which is something armies did very often, for resources because the Russians are practicing scorched earth policy. And again, the Northern Army in the American Civil War used scorched earth policy on the South. They burned Atlanta, Georgia to the ground. There's still economic repercussions for all the damage the North did. And don't be fooled. It was sketchy stuff. Like the Union soldiers raped, pillaged, and burned slave and free women alike. They did some horrible things, burning children, raping children. The Union soldiers did some pretty horrible stuff. Slaves and non-slaves alike. A lot of times people forget that, yes, the Union soldiers were fighting for freedom. That doesn't mean that they weren't racist still. That just to say that war is not black and white. There's not always a good guy, bad guy scenario, like perfectly. Not all the good guys are fully good guys. So while the Russians are using scorched earth tactics and often raiding the enemy with light cavalry, their main army retreated for almost 3 months, which leads to the main problem that Napoleon's going to face. Because Russia gets cold. Russia can experience winter as early as October or September sometimes. Russia is very cold. Like, I know that you guys in Kentucky, you think you know cold. I think the coldest it's gotten when I've been here was maybe -1. And I've been here for like 5 years, 5 or 6 years. Even in Wisconsin where I live, we're talking -40 degrees. -40 degrees. They say on the news, like, don't be outside with exposed skin for more than, 15 minutes or you get frostbite. You hear people on news that died because it was so cold, and the school is canceled because the diesel fuel and the buses will not start. That's how cold it is. You walk outside and immediately you're in complete agony. You're like, I didn't think it could be this cold. That's just Wisconsin. Russia is colder than Wisconsin. North of Russia is just a bunch of water. And then the North Pole. All that wind goes undisturbed by any mountain or anything for hundreds and hundreds of miles. And then it hits Russia. And it is just cold. Most of Russia is this area called Siberia. And in communist Russia, instead of just executing people, they would just exile them into Siberia to die of cold or be eaten by wolves. That's how cold this place is. Siberia is known for being a tundra, like basically a desert, but for being cold. You can have cold deserts, and that's pretty much what Siberia is. It's not a fun place. So Napoleon is now in Russia, deep in Russia. Remember, Russia's been retreating for months. He is deep in Russia. He thought he was going to be out of there by now, and winter is coming, and he did not bring the appropriate materials to survive the winter. So I think probably the burning of Moscow might be the last thing I'll talk about today. The Battle of Borodino on September 7th, 1812, the French and the Russian armies will clash at the Battle of Borodino. This battle is the largest and bloodiest single day of action during the Napoleonic Wars, which is what we call these wars, involving more than 250,000 soldiers and resulting in at least 70,000 casualties. What's a casualty, you might ask? It is somebody who is the number of people that are killed, wounded, or missing. So it doesn't mean 70,000 people died necessarily. Painting of that. So the French capture the battlefield but fail to destroy the Russian army. So yet again the Russians retreat, like trying to grab a watermelon that's soaked in oil that just keeps getting away from you. And more and more as well, the French are not able to replace their losses, whereas the Russians are. Russia's got plenty of people, and they're right there. Russia's got not so many people, and they're all the way in France if they need more. So it's a problem. It's kind of also another parallel with the American Civil War. The Confederates had far superior soldiers and generals, but they had a lot less people, like a lot less people, and less equipment. They didn't have as many bullets. They didn't have as modern of weapons. So the South had modern, better tactics, but they didn't have numbers and they didn't have superior weaponry. And so the South is kind of like Napoleon in this case, where every soldier they lose is really worth like 10 because they can't replace that soldier. At the end of the American Civil War, the Confederates were drafting like 14-year-old boys and like 70, 60-year-old men. You know, they were getting desperate, and a lot of them didn't even have the proper footwear, you know? So that's why in a lot of cases the Confederates were on the defense, because you can make defenses definitely a lot better. But the Union had a almost unlimited resource of men, as do the Russians here. And so the Union General Ulysses S. Grant actually gets the nickname the Butcher because he knew he had more men than the South. So what he did was he just sent in so many Union soldiers at one time that the Confederates couldn't possibly kill them all before they reached them. So the Confederates killed as many as they could, but 10 men can only kill so many men so quickly, and you have 500,000 Union soldiers coming at you. You're not going to win, you know, really, no matter what. And that's kind of a similar thing of what's happening with Napoleon, except the Russians don't have a general named the Butcher, right? So instead of that, the Russians just keep on fighting, retreating, scorched earth policy. And every soldier that Napoleon loses is a major loss. Welcome to my life. So you can look at the numbers there. The French will capture Moscow, of course, but not before the Russians burn it. Let me see where we are here in the notes. still have a little bit to do. So Napoleon expected the Tsar Alexander to eventually surrender because, you're not going to win. That's what Napoleon's thinking. He expected Alexander to surrender, but that's obviously not happening. So the Tsar of Russia then burns the holy city of Moscow to the ground, which at this point, someone should be telling Napoleon, fly, you fool. Like, they're not going to surrender. They have all this land left. They can keep on retreating. The Russians are used to the winter. They brought their winter coats because they live here. You didn't. But there will be no peace. So we have the French entering Moscow, which again was burned. You guys understand that Moscow is the capital of Russia today. They burned it to the ground just so Napoleon couldn't have it. That's how much these people didn't want to retreat. Give up. So then eventually Napoleon's like, all right, well, this isn't going anywhere. They burned down Moscow, for goodness sake. So this is where he starts the Great Retreat out of Russia. But by this point, it's already winter. So brace yourselves. Winter is coming, Napoleon. So the replenished Russian army forces Napoleon to retreat the same way he had come, through Moscow. And now he's going to be plagued by guerrilla warfare and the brutal cold. And of course, because the Russians burned all that territory, he's not getting any food from that land either. So in the following weeks, the Grand Armée, as it was called, undergoes catastrophic blows from the onset of the Russian winter, lack of supplies, and guerrilla warfare by the Russians, as I said. This is the Great Retreat. People are starving, freezing to death by the thousands. You go to bed and you wake up covered in snow and the guy beside you froze to death in the middle of the night. So it's an intense time, and he's going to lose a lot of men this way. So of the 500,000 troops that he took into Russia, only 25,000 will survive. That is like, his whole army has just been decimated by the Russian winter. The Grand Armée had lost some 380,000 men, and 100,000 had been captured. What's he going to use to fight anybody now? Like, his army's gone because of winter. And I have to say, more people die in any given war, more people die from disease and environment than bullets or swords or anything else combined. You can combine all bullets, swords, arrows, depending on what time period, combine those, and it still wouldn't match the amount of deaths from disease and environment. So Napoleon's massive army had effectively been destroyed in the course of the campaign, and so now he's left prone. He's bleeding a lot, and the other countries can smell it, and they're going to come for him because they want revenge. Got some pictures of the Great Retreat here. Why are there so many pictures? I don't know, but they're there. So we're almost done here today. At this point, all the main powers of Europe were at war with Napoleon. Napoleon was able to raise a new army, but was defeated at the Battle of Leipzig with the Allied forces. So everybody's teaming up and kind of circling around him. Again, they smell the blood. So, and when he's retreating out of France, all these other nations are like, oh, this is our chance to get him. So they do, and the Allied forces fight him, and he loses, and then he gets to Paris, and now he has to fight in Paris, and it's just a massive mess. 2 months later, Paris had been taken by the Prussian and the Russian army, and Napoleon is defeated at the Battle of Paris in 1814. So he goes into Russia to show them he means business, loses almost his entire army, goes on the retreat, and pretty much loses everything he gained over the last decade. That's really sad. April of 1814, Napoleon wanted to keep on fighting, but his generals say, no, we're finished. And so highly outnumbered and surrounded on all sides by invaders, and no real chance to, no hope. Napoleon is forced to call for a truce, and he will have to abdicate his throne, which he had been on for about 15 years. So Napoleon surrenders. And you might think that his enemies are going to order his execution, or that they're going to imprison him for life and it's going to be horrible. They're actually pretty generous to him, and not to say that they had a pretty large amount of respect for him. They're going to make him king of a small island called Elba and give him a pension. That's pretty awesome. Like, they make, you conquer Europe and your punishment is being king over a small island. You have to give up the French Empire, but I mean, at least you're not being executed or imprisoned. It's a pretty good deal. So the island of Elba, which is just off the western coast of the, it's actually pretty close to Corsica. We have a depiction of him here getting on the island of Elba. People do live there. Not very many, though. So he's going to rule this island. You can see it right here. He's going to rule this island for a brief little period of time. France is up here. This is Italy. This is Corsica. Sicily. Africa. But there's Elba. Nice and small. There's a little blown up bit of it. There it is. You can see Italy right there. For something you probably noticed about this, there's a lot of mountains. There's not a lot of things going on this island. So Napoleon gets bored very quickly. Very quickly. He's not going to be satisfied. And that is where we will leave off today. Make sure that you answer the discussion questions in Canvas, and have a lovely day.